The morning Caden Trent saw the snowman, he knew he was lost. He had risen early as always, the limp in his left leg stiff from the cold, and shuffled to the kitchen window with his first cup of tea still steaming in his hands. The world beyond the frost-etched glass had transformed overnight into a sweep of white that blanketed his modest property. The workshop, the bare vegetable garden, and the small cottage he had built with his own hands 15 years ago, when he still believed in futures that included more than one person. The snow was the first real accumulation of the season, thick enough to muffle sound and reshape familiar landmarks into soft sculptures of themselves. That was when he saw them in the yard, two small figures bundled in mismatched coats and scarves, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they worked with the fierce concentration that only children possess. The boy, Bertrand, was perhaps 7 years old, dark-haired and serious-faced, rolling a massive ball of snow across the yard with his small shoulders hunched against the effort. The girl, Marguerite, could not have been more than 4, her cheeks flushed green beneath her woolen cap as she packed handfuls of snow onto what was clearly meant to be the middle section of their creation. Caden watched, tea cooling in his grip as the structure took shape. A snowman. Nothing unusual in that. Children had been building snowmen since the first winter and would continue until the last. But as Bertrand carefully positioned the head and Marguerite danced around adding details, Caden felt something shift behind his ribs, a tightness that had nothing to do with the cold seeping through the window frame. The snowman wore a crooked hat fashioned from a scrap of brown cloth. The same brown, he realized with a jolt, as the cap he wore most days when working in his carpentry shop. One of the stick arms was shorter than the other, positioned at an awkward angle, and the base, rather than being perfectly round, had been shaped with a pronounced lean to the left. The children had built him. Not a generic snowman, but him specifically, complete with the limp that had marked him since the wagon accident 8 years ago, the injury that had taken him away from his wife's bedside for 3 critical hours, the delay that had meant he returned home to find her cold and the midwife weeping, and his daughter, his tiny perfect daughter, already wrapped and still. He set the tea down with a hand that trembled slightly through the window of the back cottage, the small addition he had built to rent out when money grew tight after the accident. He could see Grisha Dane watching her children with an expression he could not quite read. She stood with her arms crossed, her green skin darker at the cheekbones, her small tusks just visible as she smiled. She was watching them build their snowman version of him, and she was not correcting them. She was not telling them it was rude or presumptuous or any of the dozen things she might have said. She was simply letting them work, letting them shape their winter game around the image of the man who owned the property they called home. Caden turned away from the window, his throat tight. The Danes had been his tenants for 2 months now. They had arrived at the end of harvest season, when the leaves were just beginning their turn, and the air carried the first whisper of the cold to come. Grisha had knocked on his workshop door one afternoon, her son and daughter clustered close behind her skirts, and asked in a voice that expected rejection whether he had a room to let. He had stared at her for a long moment, taking in her green skin, her tusks, the pointed tips of her ears, the nervous way she held herself as though braced for violence or insult. Orcs were not common in this part of the valley, though they were not unheard of either. The war had ended a generation ago, but the suspicions and the stories lingered like smoke. Most humans looked at orcs and saw savages, monsters, enemies barely domesticated. Caden had looked at her and seen a woman alone with 2 children and autumn turning cold. 3 silver a month, he had said, which was half what he might have charged anyone else. Cottage out back has 2 rooms, a hearth, and access to the well. You keep it clean and do not interfere with my work." Relief had flooded her face, followed immediately by wariness. "Why so little?" "Because it is what I am asking," he had replied, already turning back to the chair leg he was shaping. "Take it or do not." She had taken it. In the weeks since, they had settled into an uneasy coexistence. Grisha worked in the village, taking laundry and mending from the households that would employ an orc, which were fewer than they should have been. She left before dawn most days and returned after dusk, her hands raw and her shoulders bent. The children, Bertrand and Marguerite, played quietly in the yard or inside the cottage, rarely venturing near his workshop. Caden had been glad of the distance. He did not know how to be around children anymore, had not known since the day he buried his daughter in a grave so small it had broken something fundamental inside him. He kept to his work and his routines, and did not let himself look too long at the boy's serious face or the girl's bright laughter. But the children, it seemed, had been looking at him. He forced himself to return to the window. The snowman was nearly finished now. Bertrand was carefully positioning 2 stones for eyes while Marguerite attempted to stick a small twig into the snow face for a mouth. The crooked hat sat at a jaunty angle. The lean was pronounced. It was unmistakably, undeniably meant to be him. And through the cottage window, Grisha was still watching, still smiling, still not correcting them. Caden felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the careful walls he had built to keep the world at a safe distance. He turned away again, abandoning his tea entirely, and limped toward his workshop. He had orders to fill. A set of chairs for the merchant in the village, a cabinet for the miller's wife, a dozen small projects that would keep his hands busy and his mind occupied with measurements and angles, instead of the memory of small hands shaping snow into a figure that walked with a limp. But all morning, as he worked, he could feel the snowman's presence in the yard like a weight. The children's voices drifted through the workshop walls, bright and happy, calling to each other in the way children do when they are deeply absorbed in play. He heard Bertrand's serious tone directing his sister, heard Marguerite's delighted giggle when something pleased her. He had not heard children laugh in his yard in 8 years. At midday, a knock came at the workshop door. Caden looked up from the chair rung he was sanding, his hands stilling on the wood. "Come." The door opened, and Grisha stood in the threshold, her breath misting in the cold. She wore a heavy shawl over her work dress, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid. Her green skin looked almost gray in the winter light, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many long days and too little rest. "I apologize for the snowman," she said without preamble. "The children meant no offense." Caden stared at her. "Offense?" "They built it to look like you." She shifted her weight, her hands twisting in her shawl. "It was not meant to mock. They simply—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They admire you. You are kind to us, kinder than most, and they wanted to honor that. But I understand if it makes you uncomfortable. I will have them take it down." "No," Caden said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "No, leave it. It is only snow. It will melt when the weather turns." Grisha's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her expression remained uncertain. "You are sure?" "I am sure." He turned back to his work, a clear dismissal, but she did not immediately leave. "May I ask you something?" she said after a moment. He did not look up. "You may ask." "Why did you rent to us?" "Most would not. Most would have sent us away without a word, or worse." Caden's hand stilled on the wood. It was a fair question, one he had asked himself more than once in the quiet hours of the night when sleep would not come. He could have said it was for the money, though 3 silver a month barely covered the cost of firewood. He could have said it was none of her concern, though that would have been needlessly cruel. Instead, he said, "You needed a place. I had one empty. It seemed simple enough." "Nothing is simple when you are an orc trying to find shelter in a human village," Grisha said quietly. He did look up then, meeting her eyes. They were dark, almost black, and they held a weight of experience that he recognized because he carried a similar weight himself. "Then I suppose I do not see the world the way most do." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, a small dip of her head that might have been respect or gratitude or simply acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said, "for the roof and for the kindness." She left before he could respond, pulling the workshop door closed behind her. Caden sat alone in the silence, the chair rung forgotten in his hands, and tried not to think about the snowman standing watch in his yard or the two children who had built it or their mother, who had chosen not to correct them. The days that followed were quietly strange. Caden continued his work, measuring and cutting and sanding with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most respected craftsmen in the valley, despite his injury. Customers came and went, collecting finished pieces and commissioning new ones. The winter deepened, bringing more snow and shorter days and the kind of cold that settled into bones and would not leave. And in the yard, the snowman remained, a silent witness to the small domestic rhythms of the property. The children treated it as a kind of guardian. Caden would glance out his workshop window and see them playing nearby, building snow forts or having elaborate battles with imaginary enemies, always with the snowman included in their games. Bertrand would salute it solemnly each morning before his mother took him to the village schoolhouse. Marguerite would pat its base affectionately, chattering to it in the way small children talk to inanimate objects, imbuing them with personalities and histories. Caden told himself it did not matter. It was only snow, only children playing. It had nothing to do with him. But he found himself watching them more often than he should. Watching the way Bertrand would carefully help his little sister climb over the larger drifts, his young face set with determination. Watching the way Marguerite would throw herself into the snow and make angels, her laughter bright enough to cut through the gray winter sky. Watching the way Grisha would emerge from the cottage in the early mornings, tired and worn, but still taking the time to adjust Marguerite's scarf or ruffle Bertrand's hair before she left for the long walk to the village. They were a unit, the three of them, bound together by love and necessity, and the kind of resilience that came from weathering hardship without breaking. It hurt to watch them, hurt in a way Caden had not allowed himself to feel in years, because watching them meant acknowledging what he had lost and what he had chosen to live without. His wife, Elara, had wanted children. Plural. A house full of noise and chaos and love. She had been so happy when she learned she was finally pregnant after 3 years of hoping, so radiant that Caden had thought his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. He had built the back cottage that autumn, planning to convert it into a nursery eventually, maybe add another room when the second child came, build a future as solid and well-crafted as the furniture he made. And then the wagon accident, and the hours away, and the return to find everything shattered. He had not built the nursery. He had rented the cottage instead, to strangers who needed it, and kept himself carefully separate from anything that might require him to feel that kind of hope again. But the snowman stood in his yard, built by children who had somehow decided he was worth admiring, and every time he saw it, the walls he had built felt a little less secure. 3 weeks after the first snow, the miller came by to collect the cabinet Caden had built for his wife. He was a broad, florid man named Peter, gregarious and loud, the kind of person who filled a room simply by entering it. He inspected the cabinet with the exaggerated care of someone who knew nothing about woodworking but wanted to appear knowledgeable, then finally nodded his approval. "Fine work, Trent, as always," Peter declared, counting out silver coins onto Caden's workbench. "Martha will be pleased. She has been after me for months about storage for her good linens." "I hope it serves well," Caden said, which was his standard response. Peter pocketed his purse and glanced out the workshop window, his gaze landing on the yard where Marguerite was playing in the snow under Bertrand's watchful supervision. "That is the orc woman's daughter, yes. The one renting your back cottage," Caden's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Heard you took them in." Peter's tone was carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that barely disguised judgment. "Surprised me, I must say. Did not take you for the charitable type, especially not toward their kind. They needed a place to live. I had a place to rent. No charity involved." "Still." Peter rocked back on his heels, his expression thoughtful. "Orcs are trouble, Trent. Oh, I know, the war is over and we are all supposed to live in peace and harmony now. But you know how they are. Savage blood runs deep. Would not want them influencing your work or your reputation." Caden set down the coins he had been counting, his movements deliberate. "The Danes are quiet tenants who pay their rent on time and cause no trouble. My reputation can withstand their presence." Peter raised his hands in a gesture of appeasement. "No offense meant, just friendly concern." "You are a respected man in this village, Caden. People look up to you. Would be a shame if that changed because you got mixed up with the wrong sort." "I will keep that in mind," Caden said flatly. "Was there anything else?" Peter took the hint, hefting the cabinet with a grunt. No, that is all. Good day to you, Trent." After he left, Caden stood alone in his workshop, his hands braced on the workbench, trying to slow the anger simmering in his chest. He should have expected it. The village was small and insular, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were viewed with suspicion, even in the best circumstances. An orc woman and her children would naturally attract gossip and speculation. What surprised him was how much the miller's words had angered him. He had told himself he was simply renting out an empty cottage, a business arrangement and nothing more. But the protective fury that had risen in him when Peter spoke of their kind and savage blood suggested something more complicated was happening, something he was not sure he wanted to examine too closely. He forced himself back to work, but his concentration was fractured, his mind circling back again and again to the conversation, to the way Peter had looked at the children playing in the snow as though they were something dangerous or distasteful, to the casual cruelty embedded in the assumption that Grisha and her family were lesser, other, unworthy of basic decency. That evening, as the sun set and the temperature plummeted, Caden found himself standing at his kitchen window again, looking out at the Snowman. Its crooked hat was dusted with fresh powder. Its lean seemed more pronounced in the fading light. It looked, he thought, like something that had weathered a storm and remained standing. The cottage door opened, and Grisha emerged, calling softly for the children. They came running, Marguerite's small legs pumping through the snow, Bertrand trailing behind with his serious expression. Grisha ushered them inside, her hand gentle on their backs, and for a moment before the door closed, Caden caught a glimpse of warm firelight and heard the muffled sound of Marguerite's laughter. His house, by contrast, was silent. It was always silent. He turned away from the window and busied himself with making dinner, the same simple meal he made most nights, eaten alone at a table built for four. He told himself he preferred the quiet, the solitude, the uncomplicated nature of a life built around work and routine. He told himself he did not miss the sound of another person's voice, the warmth of shared companionship, the sense of purpose that came from being needed. He told himself these things, but the snowman in the yard seemed to mock him with its crooked hat and its faithful representation of his limp, built by children who had somehow seen past his isolation to something worth admiring. The winter deepened. January arrived with bitter cold and short, gray days that felt more like extended twilight than true daylight. Caden worked through it all, his workshop heated by the large stove he kept burning, his hands moving with practiced efficiency through the familiar motions of his craft. The Danes settled more fully into their cottage, their presence becoming part of the rhythm of the property. Grisha's laundry work seemed to increase as the weather worsened. Caden would see her leaving before dawn and returning well after dark, her shoulders bent under the weight of bundles of clean linens. The children attended the village school when weather permitted, though Caden suspected they faced the same kind of casual cruelty there that their mother encountered in her work. He tried not to think about it, tried to maintain the careful distance he had established. But small things kept eroding his resolve. Like the morning he found a stack of neatly folded firewood outside his workshop door, cut and split with care, though he had not asked for it. When he inquired, Grisha admitted that Bertrand had done it, wanting to help because Caden had fixed the boy's wooden practice sword when it cracked. Or the afternoon he discovered a small snow sculpture beside the larger snowman, this one clearly meant to be a cat, complete with carefully shaped ears and a curled tail. Marguerite had made it, Grisha explained, because she had seen Caden feeding the stray tabby that sometimes haunted the property. Or the evening he emerged from his workshop to find Grisha struggling to carry water from the well, the bucket clearly too heavy for her after a long day of work. He had taken it from her without asking, limping across the yard to deposit it by her cottage door, ignoring her protests. These small exchanges accumulated like snow, each one insignificant on its own, but together building into something substantial. Caden felt the weight of it, felt the way his carefully maintained isolation was being infiltrated by kindness and proximity, and the simple fact of their shared space. And then came the evening that changed everything. It was late, well past the children's bedtime, and Caden was working by lamplight in his workshop, trying to finish a particularly intricate piece of joinery. He was so focused on the work that he almost missed the sound of running footsteps outside, the frantic hammering on his workshop door. He looked up, startled, as Bertrand burst in without waiting for permission. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his eyes wide with panic. "Please," he gasped. "Please, you have to help. Marguerite is sick. She is burning up and Mother does not know what to do." Caden was on his feet before he consciously decided to move, his tools forgotten. "Show me." He followed Bertrand across the dark yard, his limp barely slowing him despite the ice-slicked ground. The cottage door stood open, spilling warm light and the sound of harsh, labored breathing into the night. Inside, Grisha knelt beside the small cot where Marguerite lay, her green face tight with fear as she pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead. The girl was clearly in the grip of a serious fever. Her skin, normally a healthy green, had taken on a grayish cast, and her small body shook with chills despite the heavy blankets piled atop her. Her breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, and even from the doorway, Caden could hear the rattle in her chest. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, moving to kneel beside Grisha. "Since this afternoon." "I thought it was just a cold, but then the fever spiked and she started coughing and Grisha's voice cracked. I do not know what to do. The village healer will not come for orcs. I tried to get her to drink, but she will not wake properly." Caden reached out, pressing the back of his hand gently to Marguerite's forehead. She was scorching, the heat radiating off her small body in waves. Pneumonia, perhaps, or something equally serious. Without treatment, a fever like this could kill a child, orc or human. "We need to cool her down," he said, his voice steady despite the cold fear settling in his gut. "Keep the cloths coming, rotate them as soon as they warm. Bertrand, fetch more water from the well. Clean water, as much as you can carry." The boy nodded and bolted for the door. Caden looked at Grisha. Her hands were shaking as she wrung out the cloth in the basin of water beside the cot. "Has she vomited? Any blood in her cough?" "No blood. She has not eaten since midday, so nothing to vomit." "That is good. Means it might not be as advanced as it seems." He hesitated, then said, "I know someone who might help. Old Marin, the widow who lives on the far side of the valley. She was a healer during the war, saw all kinds of illnesses. She does not practice much anymore, but she might come if I ask." Grisha's head snapped up, hope and desperation warring in her expression. "Would she?" "For an orc child, she would for me," Caden said, hoping it was true. "Stay with Marguerite. Keep her as cool as you can. I will be back as soon as possible." He pushed himself to his feet, his leg protesting the sudden movement. Grisha caught his wrist, her grip strong enough to hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." He nodded once and headed for the door, grabbing his heavy cloak from the hook in his own house. The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that stole breath and bit through layers of wool. His leg ached with every step, the old injury flaring in the icy air, but he pushed himself into a lurching run toward the narrow path that led through the forest to Marin's cottage. It took him nearly an hour to reach her, his breath coming in harsh gasps by the time he pounded on her door. Marin answered in her nightgown, a shawl thrown over her shoulders, her gray hair hanging in a long braid down her back. She took one look at his face and said, "Who is dying?" "The little girl. Orc child, 4 years old, high fever, labored breathing, chills. I think it might be pneumonia." Marin's expression tightened, but she did not hesitate. "Let me get my things." She moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had responded to medical emergencies for decades, gathering her healer's kit and a thick cloak. Within minutes, they were heading back through the forest, Marin setting a pace that made Caden's legs scream in protest, but which he matched through sheer determination. "How long have you had orcs living on your property?" Marin asked as they walked. 2 months. "And you came to me for the child?" "I did." She glanced at him, her weathered face unreadable in the darkness. "People will talk. People already talk." "Fair enough." She shifted her kit to her other shoulder. "What is the mother like?" "Hardworking, devoted to her children, alone." Caden paused, then added, "Frightened." "As she should be. Fevers like this kill children all the time, orc or human." Marin's voice was matter of fact, but not unkind. "We will see what we can do." They reached the property to find Bertrand standing anxious watch by the cottage door. Inside, Grisha had stripped away the heavy blankets, following Caden's instructions to cool the fever, and was sponging Marguerite's small body with methodical desperation. The girl was unconscious, her breathing even more labored than before. Marin moved immediately to the cot, setting down her kit and beginning a swift examination. She listened to Marguerite's chest, checked her pulse, peered into her mouth and eyes. Her hands were steady and sure, the hands of someone who had saved lives and lost them, and learned to focus on the work rather than the fear. "Pneumonia," she confirmed after a few minutes. "Advanced, but not beyond treatment if we act quickly." She began pulling items from her kit, dried herbs, small vials of liquid, clean cloth for poultices. "I need boiling water as much as you can give me, and someone will need to hold her upright while I get medicine into her. She may fight it even unconscious." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Marin worked with calm competence, preparing tinctures and poultices, administering medicines with practiced ease. Caden and Grisha followed her instructions without question, Caden holding Marguerite's small body upright while Marin coaxed liquid down her throat, Grisha preparing the endless stream of hot water and clean cloths that the treatment required. Bertrand stayed awake despite his exhaustion, fetching and carrying, his young face drawn with worry. At one point, Caden found the boy standing outside staring at the snowman, tears streaming down his face. Caden put a hand on his thin shoulder and said, "Your sister is strong. She will fight this." "I am scared," Bertrand whispered. "So am I," Caden admitted, "but we will not leave her, any of us. She will not be alone." Bertrand leaned against him just for a moment, and Caden felt the boy's small body shaking with suppressed sobs. Something cracked further inside his chest, that ancient wound he had been protecting for so long, and he found himself wrapping an arm around Bertrand's shoulders, holding him the way he might have held his own son had he ever been blessed with one. "Come inside," he said quietly. "Your mother needs you." The night wore on. Marguerite's fever began to break near dawn, her temperature slowly dropping under Marin's ministrations. Her breathing eased, the terrible rattle fading to something more regular. By the time the sun rose, pale and cold over the snow-covered valley, she was sleeping naturally, her small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Marin sat back with a tired sigh, wiping her hands on a cloth. She will live. The fever broke cleanly, and her lungs are beginning to clear. She will need rest and careful watching, but the worst has passed. Grisha made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. She covered her face with her hands, her whole body shaking with the release of hours of sustained terror. Bertrand went to her immediately, wrapping his thin arms around her waist, and she pulled him close, burying her face in his dark hair. Caden stood slowly, his legs stiff from hours of kneeling, and met Marin's eyes. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but all he had. "You can thank me by getting me some breakfast and a place to rest for a few hours," Marin replied. "I am too old to run through forests in the middle of the night and then work until dawn without consequences." "Of course." Caden turned to Grisha. "I will take her to my house." "You should sleep as well. I can watch Marguerite." Grisha looked up, her face streaked with tears. "You have done enough. I cannot ask you. You are not asking. I am offering." He kept his voice gentle but firm. "You have been awake all night and you have work in the village later. Sleep for a few hours at least. I will wake you if anything changes." She looked as though she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She nodded, her shoulders sagging. "Just a few hours. Wake me if she stirs." Caden waited until Grisha and Bertrand had collapsed into the cottage's other cot, wrapped around each other in the way of people who had survived something terrible together. Then he settled into the chair beside Marguerite's cot, prepared to keep vigil. Marin paused in the doorway, studying him with an expression he could not quite read. "You care for them," she said quietly. It was not a question, but Caden answered anyway. "Yes. Be careful, Caden. Caring for people means you can lose them. You know that better than most." He looked down at Marguerite's small green face, peaceful now in healing sleep. "I know. And you are choosing to care anyway." He thought about the snowman in the yard, built with such care to resemble him. Thought about Bertrand's desperate tears and Grisha's shaking hands, and the way this small family had somehow infiltrated the walls he had built to keep the world at bay. "I do not think it is a choice anymore," he admitted. Marin smiled, sad and knowing. "No, I suppose it is not." She left, and Caden sat alone in the quiet cottage, watching Marguerite sleep. Outside, dawn light began to creep across the snow. illuminating the snowman standing guard in the yard, its crooked hat and faithful lean unchanged by the night's drama. Caden sat, and he watched, and he let himself feel the terror and relief and the awful, wonderful knowledge that he had something to lose again. Marguerite's recovery was slow but steady. For the first 2 days, she slept most of the time, waking only to drink the bitter teas that Marin had left and to eat small amounts of broth that Grisha coaxed down her throat. On the 3rd day, she was awake more often, her eyes bright with fever residue but clear, her voice a raspy shadow of its usual bright chatter. Caden found himself spending hours in the cottage, sitting beside her cot with a piece of wood and his carving knife, shaping small figures while she watched with drowsy fascination. He made her a rabbit, then a bird, then a small horse with a flowing mane. She received each one with such delight that he found himself returning to his workshop for more wood, for different tools, determined to see her smile again. "You do not have to do this," Grisha said on the 4th evening, watching him carve a tiny dragon while Marguerite dozed beside them. "I know." He kept his eyes on the wood, on the delicate work of shaping scales along the dragon's back. "You have orders waiting, your own work. You should not spend your time entertaining a sick child. The orders will still be there." He paused, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. "And I am exactly where I choose to be." Grisha was silent for a long moment. When he glanced up, she was watching him with an intensity that made something shift in his chest. Her dark eyes held questions and hope, and a kind of careful vulnerability that he recognized because he felt it himself. "Why?" she asked softly. It was the question at the heart of everything, he supposed. Why had he rented to them? Why had he run through the frozen forest for a healer? Why was he sitting here carving toys instead of maintaining the careful distance he had sworn to keep? The answer should have been complicated, tangled up in grief and fear and the protective walls he had built around his broken heart. But sitting there in the warm cottage, with Marguerite sleeping peacefully beside him and Grisha's eyes searching his face, the answer felt simple. "Because I could not bear to lose her," he said. "Or any of you." Grisha drew in a sharp breath. "Caden, I know what you are going to say. I know all the reasons this is complicated. You are orc and I am human, and the world will not look kindly on." He paused, realizing he did not quite know what to call what was happening between them. "On whatever this is. But these past few days, sitting here watching her breathe, terrified she might stop." His hand stilled on the carving. "I realized I would rather have this, have you and the children and the fear of loss, than spend the rest of my life safe and alone." The silence that followed was profound. Marguerite stirred in her sleep, making a small sound, and they both turned to her instinctively, checking without words that she was still comfortable. It was such a small gesture, such an automatic coordination, and yet it spoke to something that had been growing between them for weeks, something domestic and tender and real. "I am afraid," Grisha said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "So am I. I lost my husband 2 years ago. Killed in a farming accident, crushed under a cart that overturned in the field." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I swore I would never let myself care for anyone that way again. It hurt too much to lose him. And then I had to raise Bertrand and Marguerite alone in a world that hates us for what we are, and I thought," she swallowed hard, "I thought if I kept us moving, kept us at a distance from everyone, we would be safer." "But you are tired of moving," Caden said. "I am tired of everything." The admission seemed to cost her something. "Tired of working every hour of light to keep food on the table. Tired of seeing my children suffer for prejudice they did not earn. Tired of being alone with the weight of it all." She looked at him, her eyes shining. And then we came here, and you were kind, and the children, they watch you the way they used to watch their father, with admiration and trust and something like love. And I thought," her voice broke, "I thought perhaps we could stop running, perhaps we could stay." Caden set down the half-finished dragon and reached across the space between them, taking her work-roughened hand in his. "Stay," he said. "Please, stay." She gripped his hand so tightly it hurt, and for a long moment they simply sat there in the firelight, holding on to each other while Marguerite slept, and the night deepened outside, and the future rearranged itself around them in ways neither had planned but both desperately wanted. Over the next weeks, something subtle shifted in the household. It was not dramatic or sudden, but rather a gradual blurring of the boundaries that had previously defined their relationship as landlord and tenant. Caden found himself taking his evening meals in the cottage more often than not, sitting at Grisha's small table with Bertrand and Marguerite, sharing food and conversation and the quiet comfort of companionship. Grisha, in turn, began helping with small tasks around the property that were not strictly her responsibility, mending a torn jacket for Caden or organizing his workshop tools when he was particularly busy with an order. The children, sensing the change even if they did not fully understand it, grew bolder in their affection. Bertrand began coming to the workshop after school, watching Caden work with the same serious attention he brought to everything, asking careful questions about measurements and joints and wood grain. Caden found himself teaching the boy, showing him how to hold a plane properly, how to read the direction of the grain, how to measure twice and cut once. Marguerite, once she had fully recovered from the pneumonia, appointed herself Caden's assistant in all things. She would help him carry tools, which mostly meant she carried one small hammer while chattering endlessly about her day. She would bring him cups of water when he was working, sloshing half of it on the floor in her enthusiasm. She would fall asleep in his workshop on cold afternoons, curled up on a pile of clean wood shavings like a small cat, and he would work quietly so as not to wake her. It was terrifying. Every moment of growing attachment was a reminder of what he could lose, of the daughter he had already lost, of the way love made you vulnerable to a world that was capricious and cruel. But it was also life in a way he had not experienced in 8 years, a daily reminder that joy existed alongside grief, that choosing to risk your heart was also choosing to be fully human. The village, predictably, noticed the changes. Caden encountered more questions, more pointed comments, more thinly veiled concern about his association with the orc family. Most of it he ignored, but some crossed lines that he could not overlook. Like the afternoon the blacksmith's son, a thick-necked young man named Thomas, made a crude comment about orc women within Caden's hearing. Caden, normally reserved and peaceful, had crossed the village square and informed Thomas in a voice cold enough to frost glass that if he ever heard such words again, he would ensure that Thomas found his business going elsewhere. The young man had tried to laugh it off, to claim he meant no harm, but Caden's expression had silenced him. "Grisha Dane is under my protection," Caden had said quietly, "as are her children. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me. I suggest you remember that." Word of the confrontation spread, as word always did in small villages. Caden felt the shift in how people looked at him, the mixture of surprise and disapproval, and in some cases, grudging respect. He found he did not care as much as he had expected to. The opinions of people who would judge a woman and her children for the shape of their ears and the color of their skin suddenly seemed less important than ensuring those under his roof felt safe. Grisha heard about the incident from one of the other laundresses. That evening, after the children were asleep, she found Caden in his workshop finishing a delicate inlay on a cabinet door. "You did not have to defend me," she said from the doorway. He looked up from his work. "Yes, I did. People will think," she paused, searching for words. "They will assume things about us. Let them assume." She crossed to stand beside his workbench, her expression troubled. "You will lose customers. The village already gossips. If they think you are," she flushed slightly, the green of her cheeks darkening. "If they think there is something between us, it could hurt your business." Caden set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "Is there something between us?" The question hung in the air, honest and direct. Grisha met his gaze, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, fear and hope battling for dominance. "I do not know," she said finally. "I know I think about you constantly. I know the children love you. I know that when I am in the village working, I spend half my time looking forward to coming home because you will be here. I know," she took a breath. "I know I have not felt this way about anyone since my husband died, and it terrifies me." "It terrifies me too," Caden admitted. "I lost my wife 8 years ago. Childbirth. The baby died as well, a little girl. For 8 years I have kept everyone at a distance because I could not bear the thought of caring for someone and losing them again." He stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting. "And then you and Bertrand and Marguerite arrived, and somehow you slipped past all my defenses. I do not know when it happened exactly. Maybe when I saw the Snowman, maybe before that, but it happened, and now," he stepped closer to her. "Now I would rather have whatever time I can have with you, even knowing I could lose it, than go back to being safely alone." Grisha's eyes were wet. "The world will not make this easy. The world has never made anything easy for either of us. My children, they have lost one father already. If this does not work, if you change your mind—" "I will not change my mind," Caden interrupted. "I am not perfect, Grisha. I am damaged and stubborn, and I carry grief like most people carry their name. But I do not make promises lightly, and I am promising you now that if you give me the chance, I will do everything in my power to be what you and the children need." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the exact instant when she decided to trust him, to take the leap. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, soft and tentative, and then with growing certainty. Caden wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, feeling the solid reality of her body against his, and thought that maybe, after 8 years of winter, he was finally allowing himself to feel spring. Winter gave way slowly to early spring, the snow receding in patches to reveal the muddy earth beneath. The Snowman melted gradually, its crooked hat eventually toppling into the slush, its lean becoming a collapse. The children mourned its passing with the solemnity of a funeral, and Caden found himself promising that they would build another next winter, a promise that assumed a future together that felt both fragile and inevitable. His relationship with Grisha deepened in the quiet way of people who had both survived loss and were choosing carefully to build something new. They did not rush. There were no grand declarations beyond that night in the workshop. Instead, there were small intimacies. Her hand finding his across the dinner table, his lips pressed to her forehead when she was tired, quiet conversations in the evening about their pasts and their hopes, and the practical realities of building a life together. The children blossomed in the security of it. Bertrand grew more confident, spending hours in the workshop learning Caden's trade with a dedication that suggested real talent. Marguerite became even more exuberant, her laughter a constant soundtrack to the property, and she began calling Caden Papa Caden in a way that made his throat tight every time he heard it. There were challenges, of course. The village's prejudice did not disappear simply because Caden had declared his protection of the Danes. There were still shops that would not serve Grisha, still mothers who pulled their children away when Bertrand or Marguerite approached. Caden used what influence he had to counter it, making it quietly clear that anyone who wanted his business would need to treat his family with respect, but he knew there were limits to what he could accomplish. The limits became starkly apparent on a cold morning in early March when Bertrand came home from school with a black eye and split lip. He tried to hide it, ducking his head and heading straight for the cottage, but Caden caught his arm gently. "What happened?" "Nothing." Bertrand's voice was sullen, defensive. "That does not look like nothing." Caden crouched down, ignoring the protest from his bad leg so he could meet the boy's eyes. "Tell me." Bertrand's face crumpled. "Some of the older boys, they said," his voice broke, "they said terrible things about Mother. About orcs. They said you were probably going to throw us out once you got tired of Mother, that you were just using her like humans always use orcs. And I told them to shut up and they hit me." Rage, cold and focused, settled in Caden's chest. "Who?" "The miller's son Peter and his friends." "But you cannot do anything. It will just make it worse." Caden stood slowly. "Go inside. Have your mother tend your face. I will be back soon." He walked to the village with a purpose that must have shown on his face because people gave him wide berth. He found Peter Jr. and his gang of friends loitering near the blacksmith shop, laughing and shoving each other with the careless cruelty of young men who had never faced real consequences. "You," Caden said, his voice cutting through their noise. "Peter." The young man turned, his expression shifting from amusement to wariness when he saw Caden's face. "Trent." "What, you put your hands on my boy," Caden said, his voice deadly quiet. "You insulted his mother. You spread lies and then used violence when he defended his family. Your boy." Peter laughed, the sound nervous. "He is an orc brat, Trent, not your son. He is under my protection and my roof. That makes him mine." Caden stepped closer. "And you are going to apologize to him, publicly, or you and I are going to have a very different conversation." "You cannot tell me I can, and I am." Caden's hands were fists at his sides. "Your father already spreads poison about my family in the village. I have tolerated it because I am trying to be a civilized man. But if you think I will tolerate you assaulting a child, you have gravely misunderstood the situation." Peter's friends had gone quiet, sensing the danger in Caden's tone. Peter himself looked torn between his usual bravado and genuine uncertainty. "My father says orcs are dangerous. That you are making a mistake taking them in. Your father is wrong, and if you follow his example, you will grow into the same kind of small, frightened man he is." Caden's voice softened slightly but lost none of its steel. "You have a choice, Peter. You can apologize and learn to be better than your father, or you can continue down this path and discover that there are consequences for cruelty. Decide." The young man stared at him, clearly wrestling with himself. Finally, he muttered, "I will apologize," loudly, "so that everyone who heard your insults hears your apology." Peter flushed with humiliation but nodded. Caden turned and walked away without waiting for further response. He was shaking by the time he reached the edge of the village, adrenaline and fury still coursing through his system. He had never been a violent man, even before the injury that had left him with a limp. But the protective rage that had filled him at the sight of Bertrand's battered face had been almost overwhelming, a primal need to defend what was his family. When had he started thinking of them that way? But of course, he knew. It had been a gradual claiming, built moment by moment from the first time he rented them the cottage to the Snowman in the yard to Marguerite's fever to Grisha's kiss. They were his family now, the family he had thought he could never have again, and he would protect them with everything he had. That evening, Peter Jr. appeared at the property, looking sullen and ashamed. In front of Bertrand and Grisha and Caden, he offered a stiff apology for his words and his violence. It was not eloquent and it was clearly coerced, but it was public and it was acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and that mattered. After he left, Bertrand threw his arms around Caden's waist. "Thank you," the boy whispered. Caden held him, one hand cupping the back of his head. "You defended your mother and yourself. That took courage. But you do not have to fight those battles alone anymore. We are a family. We defend each other." Over Bertrand's head he met Grisha's eyes. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her green cheeks, but she was also smiling in a way that transformed her entire face. That night, after the children were asleep, Caden asked her to marry him. It was not romantic in the traditional sense. They were sitting at his kitchen table, drinking tea, discussing the practical concerns of blending their households more formally. He was explaining that he could convert part of his house to give the children proper rooms when he heard himself say, "Or we could simply get married and make this official." Grisha's cup froze halfway to her mouth. "What?" Caden blinked, realizing what he had said, but he did not take it back. "Married, I am asking you to marry me." "That was the least romantic proposal I have ever heard," she said, but there was laughter in her voice beneath the shock. "I am a carpenter, not a poet." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "But I mean it, Grisha. I want this to be permanent. I want you and the children here always. I want to build a life together that does not depend on rental agreements or temporary arrangements. I want—" he paused, searching for the right words. "I want to wake up every morning knowing you are beside me and fall asleep every night the same way. I want to watch Bertrand become a man and Marguerite grow into whoever she is meant to be. I want all of it, the messy and the beautiful and the terrifyingly uncertain, as long as I get to experience it with you." Grisha was openly crying now. "The village will never accept it. Some will. Some will not. We will find a way." He squeezed her hand. "I am not asking for easy, Grisha. I am asking for real. Will you marry me?" She nodded, unable to speak, and Caden felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for 8 long years. Hope. Purpose. A reason to believe that the future could be more than just endurance. They decided to wait until spring was fully established to marry, giving the weather time to clear and allowing them to prepare properly. The announcement of their engagement created exactly the stir Caden had expected in the village. Some people were supportive, like old Marin, who cackled with delight and declared she had seen this coming from the moment Caden ran through the forest for a sick orc child. Others were scandalized or openly hostile, muttering about the degradation of human standards and the dangers of mixing with orc kind. Caden found he cared less and less what the hostile voices said. He was too busy building an addition onto his house to create proper bedrooms for Bertrand and Marguerite, too occupied with planning a simple wedding ceremony, too engaged in the daily joys and challenges of his expanding family to waste energy on people determined to be miserable. One evening in mid-April, as the last patches of snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, Caden came home from the village to find Bertrand and Marguerite waiting for him on the porch, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Papa Caden." Marguerite launched herself at him the moment he was within range. "We have to ask you something important," he caught her, swinging her up despite his legs' protest. "What is so important that it cannot wait for me to catch my breath?" Bertrand approached more sedately, his serious young face doing a poor job of hiding his own excitement. "Mother said we should ask you properly, so we are asking." He took a deep breath, clearly reciting something he had practiced. "When you marry Mother, will you be our real father? Can we call you Papa instead of Papa Caden?" Caden's throat closed. He looked from Bertrand's earnest face to Marguerite's hopeful one, and then beyond them to where Grisha stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. "You do not have to," she said quietly. "I told them to ask, but you should not feel obligated. You have already given us so much." "Yes," Caden interrupted, his voice rough. "Yes, you can call me Papa. I would be honored." Marguerite shrieked with joy and threw her arms around his neck. Bertrand's face split into the widest smile Caden had seen from the boy, and he stepped forward to wrap his arms around Caden's waist. The three of them stood there in an awkward tangle of limbs and emotion, and Caden felt tears streaming down his face for the first time in years. When the children finally released him and ran off to play, chattering about having a real papa again, Caden limped over to Grisha. She was still crying, her face radiant despite the tears. "They asked me first," she said. "This morning. Wanted to know if it was all right to think of you as their father. I told them they should ask you directly, that this was too important a decision to make without your agreement." "They are my children now," Caden said simply. "Yours and mine. I do not need a ceremony to make that true, but I am glad they felt comfortable asking." She kissed him then. They're on the porch in full view of anyone who might be passing by, and Caden kissed her back without hesitation or shame. This was his family. This was his life. And he would not hide it or apologize for it to anyone. The wedding took place on a bright May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the valley and the air finally losing its bitter edge. It was a small ceremony, held in the village church, despite some protests from the more conservative members of the congregation. The pastor, a thoughtful man who had known Caden for years, had agreed to perform the service after a long conversation about love and prejudice, and the teachings that insisted all souls were equal in the eyes of the divine. Marin stood as witness for Caden. Grisha had no family in the region, but several of the women she worked with in the village came to stand with her, a quiet act of solidarity that touched them both. Bertrand and Marguerite stood at the front, dressed in their best clothes, watching with solemn joy as their mother and their new father exchanged vows. When it came time for the rings, simple bands that Caden had commissioned from the village silversmith, Bertrand stepped forward to hand them over with all the gravity of someone performing a sacred duty. Marguerite, not to be outdone, announced loudly that she had helped pick the flowers for her mother's bouquet, which drew gentle laughter from the small gathering. The vows were traditional, ancient words about love and commitment, and choosing each other above all others. Caden spoke them clearly, his voice unwavering, his eyes locked on Grisha's face. She spoke hers with equal certainty, her green skin glowing in the morning light streaming through the church windows, her small tusks visible as she smiled. When the pastor pronounced them married, Caden kissed his wife with a tenderness that acknowledged everything they had survived to reach this moment. The gathering applauded, the sound echoing in the small church, and Marguerite cheered so loudly that even the most disapproving attendees could not help but smile. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Friends and supporters gathered at Caden's property for food and drink and music. There was dancing, which Caden participated in despite his limp, spinning Grisha around their yard while the children laughed and people clapped along to the fiddler's tune. It was not grand or sophisticated, but it was real and warm and filled with genuine happiness, which was all either of them had ever wanted. As evening fell and the guests began to drift away, Caden found himself standing in the yard with Bertrand and Marguerite, looking at the place where the Snowman had stood months ago. The ground was now covered in grass and early spring flowers, all evidence of that frozen sculpture long since melted away. We should build another one next winter, Bertrand said thoughtfully. But this time we should build two, Papa and Mama. And us, Marguerite added. A whole Snow family. A whole family, Caden agreed, looking toward the house where Grisha was helping Marin clean up the remains of the celebration. His wife. His children. His life, messy and complicated and more precious than anything he had ever built with his hands. That night, after the children were finally asleep in their new rooms and the house was quiet, Caden stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard one last time. Grisha came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "Regrets?" she asked softly. He smiled, remembering the conversation in the workshop months ago when she had asked him why. "No, never. This is exactly where I am meant to be. Even though the world makes it difficult, especially because the world makes it difficult." He turned to face her, cupping her face gently in his work-roughened hands. "You and the children are worth every difficulty, every challenge, every moment of uncertainty. I was dead for 8 years just going through the motions. You brought me back to life. You saved us," she countered. "Gave us a home when no one else would. Loved us when you had every reason to protect yourself." "We saved each other," Caden said. "And we will keep doing it every day for as long as we have." They stood there in the quiet house, holding each other, two people who had lost everything and somehow found it again in the last place either had expected. Outside, the spring night was gentle and full of promise. Inside, their children slept safe and loved. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The years that followed were not without challenges. The village's prejudice against orcs remained a persistent undercurrent in their lives, flaring up in small ways that ranged from mildly annoying to genuinely hurtful. There were shops that still would not serve Grisha or the children. There were parents who would not allow their sons and daughters to play with Bertrand or Marguerite. There were whispered comments and pointed looks, and all the petty cruelties that small-minded people could devise. But there were also allies. Old Marin became a frequent visitor and a beloved grandmother figure to the children. Several of Grisha's fellow laundresses formed genuine friendships with her, no longer seeing her as merely the orc woman but as Grisha, a person with her own hopes and fears and dreams. Some of Caden's customers, particularly those who had worked with him for years and trusted his judgment, accepted his family without reservation. And crucially, Caden and Grisha built their life in such a way that the village's opinion, while relevant, was not the defining factor in their happiness. They created a home that was a refuge, a place of warmth and laughter and security that stood independent of outside approval. Their love for each other and for the children was the foundation, solid and unshakable, and everything else was built upon that. Bertrand grew into a skilled carpenter under Caden's tutelage, his natural talent blossoming with practice and patience. By the time he was 12, he was producing work fine enough to sell, and by 15, he was taking commissions of his own. He remained serious and thoughtful, but he also developed a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was valued and loved exactly as he was. Marguerite grew into a bright, curious girl with an infectious enthusiasm for life. She had her mother's determination and her father's, for she thought of Caden as her father in every way that mattered, careful attention to detail. She loved stories and music and animals, and she had a gift for befriending even the most reserved individuals. More than once, Caden watched her charm a disapproving villager into smiling despite themselves, and he marveled at her ability to see the good in people even when they had not earned it. Grisha flourished in ways that broke Caden's heart and put it back together again. The constant fear and exhaustion that had marked her when they first met gradually faded, replaced by a settled contentment. She still worked hard, but now she worked on their home, their garden, their family, rather than scraping by in the village for people who barely tolerated her presence. She smiled more. She laughed more. She allowed herself to hope and plan and dream in ways she had not permitted herself since her first husband's death. And Caden himself, the man who had thought his capacity for joy had died with his first wife and daughter, discovered that the heart could heal if given the right circumstances. The limp remained, the physical reminder of that long-ago accident, but the internal wound slowly closed. He learned to let himself feel the full spectrum of emotion again, to experience fear and love and hope without the protective numbness that had characterized his existence for so long. There were nights when he woke from nightmares about losing them, about coming home to find Grisha or the children gone, taken by illness or accident or the casual violence of a prejudiced world. But Grisha would wake with him, holding him until the fear passed, reminding him with her presence and her love that they were here. They were real, they were his. 2 years after the wedding, as winter approached again and the first snows began to fall, the family stood together in the yard and built their snow sculptures. Not just a snowman this time, but 4 figures holding hands in a circle. Papa with his crooked hat and his lean. Mama with her tusks and her strong shoulders. Bertrand, serious and tall for his age. Marguerite, small and bright. A family, rendered in snow, built with love and laughter and the kind of joy that could only come from surviving hardship together. They stood back when it was finished, admiring their work, and Caden felt Grisha slip her hand into his. "You remember the first snowman?" she asked softly. "Every detail," he replied. "The moment I saw it, I knew I was lost." "I knew too," she admitted. "I saw you watching from the window, and I saw your face, and I knew you were beginning to care despite yourself. I should have corrected them, told them it was presumptuous to build you without asking, but I could not bring myself to do it. I am glad you did not. So am I." Marguerite, overhearing, piped up. "What are you talking about?" "Just remembering," Grisha said, pulling her daughter close. "Remembering how we became a family." "Because Papa Caden let us live here," Bertrand said, his arms slung around his father's shoulders. He was tall enough now that the gesture did not require reaching. "And because he loved us. Because we loved him back," Marguerite added, "even before we knew we were allowed to." Caden looked at his family, these people who had somehow found him when he had given up on being found, and felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he was overwhelmed by gratitude. "I am the one who should be grateful," he said. "You gave me back my life." "We gave it to each other," Grisha said firmly. "That is how family works." They stood together as the snow continued to fall, as the light faded toward evening, as the world around them grew quiet and cold and beautiful. 4 people who had found each other against the odds, who had chosen each other despite the easier path of remaining separate, who had built something lasting from the fragile materials of hope and trust and love. Inside, the house waited, warm and welcoming. Dinner would need to be made, chores completed, the ordinary tasks of living attended to. But for this moment, they simply stood together in the snow, a family complete, and let themselves be happy. That night, after the children were in bed, Caden and Grisha sat by the fire in companionable silence. He was sketching plans for a new design, a rocking chair with intricate scrollwork, while she mended a jacket that Bertrand had torn during his latest carpentry project. The silence was comfortable, the kind that only comes when 2 people are completely at ease with each other. "Caden," Grisha said eventually, not looking up from her work. Thank you." He glanced over at her, confused. "For what?" "For seeing us." "Really seeing us, not just our green skin or our tusks or the prejudices others attached to us. for seeing me as a woman who needed help and the children as children who needed a home, for taking a risk on us when you had every reason to protect yourself. She looked up then, meeting his eyes. For loving us even when it was hard. Caden set down his sketch. It was never hard to love you. Letting myself love you, letting myself be vulnerable again, that was hard. But the love itself was the easiest thing I have ever done. You say that now, she said with a small smile. Wait until Bertrand is a full teenager and Marguerite decides she wants to marry a bard and travel the world. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Then I suppose we will navigate those challenges together, the way we have navigated everything else. Together, she agreed. Always together. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet white. And in the small house on the edge of the village, a family that should not have existed, that the world had tried its best to prevent, settled into the ordinary magic of an evening at home. Years later, when the children were grown and starting lives of their own, when Bertrand had his own carpentry business, and Marguerite had indeed run off with a musician, though a respectable one who truly loved her, Caden would think back on that first winter, on the snowman built in his image by children who barely knew him but wanted to honor him anyway, on their mother, watching from the window and choosing not to correct them, choosing instead to let them imagine a world where the broken man who owned their cottage might become something more. He would think about how that single choice, that moment of not correcting them, had been the beginning of everything. How it had represented hope and possibility, and the kind of irrational optimism that children possess and adults often lose. How Grisha had allowed her children to dream of a father, and in doing so, had allowed him to dream of being a father again. He would think about the years that followed, the challenges and the joys, the way they had built a life together out of loss and loneliness, and the courage to try again. He would think about the way love had a way of finding you even when you had given up on it, seeping through the cracks in your defenses like water, persistent and patient, and ultimately unstoppable. But in that moment, sitting by the fire with his wife while his children slept peacefully in their rooms, Caden thought about none of this. He simply existed in the present, grateful and content, a man who had been given a second chance at happiness and had taken it with both hands. The snow fell outside, the fire burned low, and in the quiet house, love endured, steady and sure, built to last through whatever winters might come.